Welcome everybody to another great interview with one of my favorite astrologers. I get his monthly newsletter, which is so informative because he always goes into the astrology and then globally how it's impacting everyone politically. It's really interesting. And so his name is Melvin Artley. So let me give you his bio. Melvin was born and grew up in the US and trained in physics, receiving an undergraduate degree in the subject, and then working afterwards in the engineering sector. His primary focus over the past 30 years has been on the sciences as they express the hidden aspect of nature and with bridging work between the two. Just similar goal that invisible architecture has. Melvin's special interests are the human subtle energy system, the chakras or energy centers, physics and technology, astronomy, and all aspects of Oriental occultism. Under the suggestion of one of his teachers, he's done extensive work with Chinese astrology and the cycles they use, and it's been his passion to bring together the great Western and Oriental systems that such matter over the years. Melvin has been a practicing astrologer for more than 30 years, and he is accredited by the American Federation of Astrologers. He's lectured on many aspects of esoteric studies and written numerous articles with several nonprofit organizations dedicated to the teaching of esoteric wisdom, most notably the University of Seven Rays. Melvin lived in Australia for almost 20 years and now lives in northern Italy. Lucky guy. So yeah, welcome, welcome.
Thanks.
So, he was going to talk today, was going to be on the subjective cycles of the planets. Most people are so into the objective cycles. We always hear that, but they also have a subjective cycle. And he's going to synthesize that with the Oriental teachings of the planets, right? Is that about it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so how do you want to begin? Like with what?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background. As an astrologer, having studied astrology since I was just a lad of 21, I've become well acquainted with the orthodox cycles of the planets, you know, the orbital cycles. Mm-hmm. And their astronomical peculiarities, the nodes, the synodic cycles, which are quite important actually. We just had one at the start of last year, which signaled actually the pandemic and the shift between the East and the West, you know, the end of an old era, the beginning of a new one. And that was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. Mm-hmm. But there are other cycles as well, and there are cycles that go beyond the standard orbital cycles, like the 12-year cycle of Jupiter, the 28, 29-year cycle of Saturn, and so forth. There are primary order cycles, second order cycles, even third order cycles, and we'll get to some of those in a bit. There are also subjective cycles. In esoteric literature, these are called ray cycles. Now, in the latter part of the 1990s, I had a sort of mentor, I call him a teacher, which was referenced in the biography, and he recommended that I study Chinese astrology. And so I went out and bought all the books I could. Some of the best books I found were by Derek Walters, because he's a Chinese scholar to start with.
I've read all his too.
Yeah, he was able to translate all the old Chinese literature. And there's one book in particular, this one, which is a compendium on all sorts of Chinese astrology. There's feng shui in there. He goes through all the bases for the philosophy. But there's one particular page in there where he talks about planetary terms, as they're called, and these used to appear on feng shui plates. They don't anymore. The only one that really appears there with any sort of frequency is the planetary term of Venus. Now,
Why do you think that is?
well, we'll cover that in a bit, but basically,
because that's interesting.
yeah, basically they relate to periods in a person's life which aren't normally covered in Chinese astrology, for instance. Chinese astrology relies, in terms of the four pillars, on the 10-year luck cycle, as it's called, which is the progressed four pillars, basically. But the planetary terms refer to the primary cycle of the planet and the secondary cycle of the planet. Now, the primary cycle is the standard orbital cycle. So you have basically a year for Venus and Mercury, so on and so forth. The second order cycle deals with the planetary nodes, where the planet crosses the ecliptic. And there's a cycle in that too. So we're, as astrologers, we're quite familiar with the cycle of the lunar node, which is 19 years. And the progressed lunar cycle, which is closely tracking the Saturn cycle, orbital cycle. So he outlined these second order cycles, and I'll briefly go through them. The Mercury second order cycle is 65 years. So this is when the primary cycle coincides at the same place with the transiting node. So every 65 years you have this cycle of Mercury, and that can be gauged by the transits of Mercury across the sun, which we have. And it will coincide when the little dot of Mercury in the transit across the sun appears directly in the center of the sun. That would be the ideal. You don't always see it that way, but that's the way it appears. The second order cycle of Venus is 8 years. The second order cycle of Mars is 79 years. Now, back in the ancient Chinese days, people generally didn't live to be 79 years old. So that's one reason the planetary term for Mars kind of fell out of favor.
I see.
You can do a half measure, I suppose, but what's really the point? You go through a partial cycle of Mars through the second order cycle of Mars through your life, and hopefully you get to 79 years old, maybe not. The second order cycle of Jupiter is 83 years. That closely corresponds with the primary cycle of Uranus, 84 years. Those four planets were listed in the planetary terms, and then we come to Saturn. And the second order cycle for Saturn was 9 years. And I looked and I looked and I looked, I could not find an astronomical correlation between that 9-year cycle for Saturn and the standard orbital cycle. It didn't make any sense. So I went back to this teacher and I said, listen, there's no astronomical correspondence between these two. He says, oh no, it's a valid cycle. So having studied esoteric studies, especially Alice Bailey over the past decades. I won't say how many decades. There are brief mentions of certain ray cycles, and DK, as he's called, lists 4 of them outright. So each of these correspond to a planet as well. So there's a first ray cycle, which corresponds with an etheric planet, Vulcan. And the first ray cycle has a period of 10 years. Now that interestingly corresponds to the 10-year Lux cycles in Chinese astrology. There are also magnitudes of order with each of these ray cycles. So you have a yearly cycle, 10-year cycle, a century cycle, a millennial cycle. These are all manifestations of the first ray. The first ray is correlated with will or power. So we're dealing with political expediencies here in terms of mundane astrology. And if you go back through history, you can see repeats, every 100 years. We might get to that a little later. The second ray cycle is associated with Jupiter, and it has a 500-year cycle, or 50 or 5-year cycle, or 5,000. The other cycle that's mentioned is the 7th ray, which is associated with Uranus, and that's 7,000 years, or divisions thereof. Now, in the books, especially esoteric astrology, he mentions that Saturn transmits the 3rd ray. And here we have this second order cycle of Saturn at 9 years. So I started working with it, and lo and behold, this 9-year cycle of Saturn corresponds with the ray cycle, the subjective cycle of the planet. It also fits very nicely in with the magic square.
Right, of Saturn. Yeah, the
That's
Bagua
right.
that people are familiar with.
Yep. And there are other cycles as well. But the point here is that there are, in Chinese astrology, for instance, especially the 4 pillars, you're dealing not really with astrology so much as you are a more advanced form of numerology, which is based in these ray cycles. So you have the 5 elements, which are associated with Jupiter. You have the 12-year great year cycle, which is the orbital cycle of Jupiter. And you combine those two, and you have the 60-year social cycle, as I call it, that repeats in terms of geopolitics. That's one aspect of it. You have the 10-year first ray cycles of development in the progressive 4 pillars. You have each of the elements has its yin and yang correspondence, which folds out into the 10-year cycle. So there's a correspondence there. So you have the 3 major planets of the 3 major ray cycles, 1, 2, and 3, all represented in Chinese astrology.
Wow.
And feng shui. Now, I'm not a feng shui expert. I'll leave that to you.
But this is it's so great. I love your synthesis of it. It's so interesting.
Yeah. It's been very interesting to me to explore all this and to have
Is this master Chinese or Western? Or this teacher you have?
Well, he was a Westerner. He's passed on now.
Uh-huh.
But he ended up in monasteries in Mongolia and Tibet.
Ah, I see.
So he learned all this stuff.
Mm-hmm. So you were so
He was
lucky to inherit it.
Yeah, he was also a spook, as I call him. You know, he had insight.
Mhm.
So
Oh, not
no,
a
I tried.
CIA spook.
No, not a CIA spook. No.
Okay.
Maybe cosmic intelligence agency, but yeah. So I took him at his word when I explored this, and you know, I was rewarded with what I found.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so these subjective cycles of the planets work out in terms of Chinese astrology. Now, my next task was to sort of blend the two and see how they fit together. So what I've eventually found was that Chinese astrology kind of tells you who you are. It's a thumbnail sketch for sure. You know, it's not as detailed as Western astrology with our Western mentality that likes to dissolve everything into its little bits. You know, so we can
Mm-hmm.
put them in our models here and there. Um, Oriental philosophy is much more poetic. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it tries to talk about wholeness of the person instead of all the details.
Not the quantum astrology of the West.
Yeah. What we have in Western astrology is how we fit into environment, which corresponds somewhat with the feng shui. But with Western astrology, we're looking outwards and trying to figure out how the environment has shaped us rather than how we shape the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So with the two, you get sort of a complete picture of a person,
Mm-hmm.
a roadmap, if you will, the inner destiny as it correlates with the outer circumstance. So I look on Western astrology as like the signposts on the road. You know, they give you warnings, they give you information.
Mm-hmm.
Take the information or not. Sometimes to your peril, sometimes it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Sometimes you find interesting roads if you miss the sign.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
with Chinese astrology, it it informs a sort of transformation. It describes a process of transformation. So in the four pillars, for instance, the year pillar describes the first quarter of a person's life. So I'm a fire monkey in the year 1956. And the first quarter of my life was very much monkey-like. You know, I was into everything. I like to play with every sort of gadget I can get my hands on, which
Mm-hmm.
led me into my career. The month pillar relates to the family. For instance, the family influences the father, mother, aunts, uncles, and first cousins and siblings. But that's from basically around between 21, 28 years and the next period, multiple.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when we enter into adult life, where we really begin to interact with the world, but we bring with us that family conditioning. And we either work with that as a positive, or it works against us, you know, as a sort of trauma that we have to sort of resolve.
Mm-hmm.
And we often do that through our kids, you know, because that's our childbearing years.
Mm-hmm.
The third, the day pillar, actually describes the self, you know, because once we've gone through the childhood years, the parenting years, we enter into our sort of true self. But the day pillar is quite interesting because also applies very much to medical astrology, or TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. And the animal associated with it, I'll get to what the animal actually represents in a minute. And the element associated with it can tell you a lot about your general state of health and what you need to work with in terms of elemental emphases. So for instance, if you look at a 4 pillars chart, you'll normally see in most programs the master element on the top, as it's called, which is the just to list them: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each of these is associated with a planet too. So the wood planet is Jupiter, the fire planet is Mars. They're related to the colors, by the way.
Mhm.
The earth planet is Saturn, which deals with placement. The metal planet is Venus. Venus is also called the Great White because it's, that's how it appears. It's the great white star that rises or sets with the sun. And then the black planet, or the water planet, which is Mercury. So you have these across the top, and they each have their yin and yang influence. And then you have this animal, as it's called. Well, the animal is not really accurate in terms of representing anything. It's just an easy way to remember a part of a cycle.
Right.
So the animals, you have 12 animals, right? So there again, you come back to this idea of the Jupiter cycle. So the animals represent parts of the Jupiter cycle. The rat is the commencement of the cycle, the pig is the end of it. And the phase of the Jupiter cycle represented by the animal will tell you a lot about the sort of emphasis you have on each quarter of your life.
Mhm.
You can also apply that to the luck pillars, as they're called, or the progress pillars. Of interest also is that the 4 pillars are based on a solar cycle or a solar calendar, whereas the lunar year and the lunar months are based in the moon.
Mhm.
So the 4 pillars start around the 3rd, 4th, or sometimes 5th of February, called the Li Chun. So the Li Chun in the year will describe when your 4 pillars start. So if you're born, for instance, on the 2nd of February, even though the year may have started before the Lunar New Year, your year pillar will be the sign before.
Mhm.
It gets a little bit confusing. I taught a Chinese astrology class early on in Australia, and we had one student in the class who was born on the 2nd of February, and she could never figure out why she had these characteristics of a sheep, for instance, when she thought she was a monkey.
I've had several like that, and it's difficult to put that all together, you know?
Yeah. So if we take the animals, for instance, and not think of them in terms of their characteristics, but think of them instead in terms of a cycle, then you get a better sense of what the 4 pillars chart is trying to tell you. Now, if you connect that also with the Bagua,
Mhm.
the magic square, and Saturn, you get an idea of how you should be placed for the year. This is not something I work with too much.
Mhm.
If I'm having difficulty in a particular year, I'll look at it and make a few corrections in the environment. But basically, the Saturn, being the Earth planet, represents our sense of placement in the Earth.
Mhm.
And in fact, the 3rd ray is very much connected with divine intelligence or Mother Nature, for instance. So the placement of Saturn, for instance, in a Western horoscope tells us much about our karma, for instance, the necessities that we have to bear, and the restrictions under which we're placed, but also at the same time our opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we feel restricted, we have to think outside the box, don't we?
Right.
And we gain an intelligence through that. So you begin to see how the third ray of intelligence, or active intelligence as it's called, is associated with restriction in one way, but also learning about environment, learning why there's a restriction. It's all about learning, isn't it?
Right. Continually.
Yeah, continually. The Jupiter cycle is related to growth. You know, the wood planet
Mm-hmm.
is associated with the green element, with spring, and new growth. In terms of the planet, going back to the planetary terms, Jupiter is associated, governs birth and growth. Birth referring to the 12-year cycle, or the great year as it's called, and growth related to the second ray cycle. The second ray is connected with love and wisdom, and that's how we grow as human beings. So through learning to love more fully, we gain in wisdom, for instance. Venus, the Venus term is related to the harvest, to Libra in the Western astrology, or Taurus. And we see that Venus is associated with vision on the path through Taurus. It's also in the spring, so the plants are coming up through the ground. In the September month, or October month as it is, everything is dying off. So there's a sort of dichotomy with Venus that you don't see with the other planets. But Venus is associated with assimilation, with integration. In the esoteric astrology, it governs the Ajna center. It transmits the fifth ray, which is the human mind itself. And the fifth ray is associated with science,
Mm-hmm.
and with concrete knowledge. And there's a very close relationship between Saturn and Venus in that regard, because you don't really have much science without intelligence. The two are very closely related. Even at that, you don't see Venus represented in Chinese astrology. It all resolves back into the Saturn, for
I
instance.
see. Yeah.
The sixth ray, there's 7 rays, by the way. So you have the first ray of will and power, second ray of love and wisdom, third ray of active intelligence and philosophy. That's the higher expression of it. The fourth ray of conflict or beauty, the fifth ray of concrete knowledge and science, the sixth ray of devotion or fanaticism, and the seventh ray of order or ceremonial magic.
Supposedly where we're moving into.
Well, the ray cycle is already on us.
Mm-hmm.
The Aquarian age will manifest this ray in a splendid manner, basically. And there are certain countries that have the seventh ray associated with them, like Russia and Spain, for instance. Each nation has its certain ray qualities as well. So the ones that are not represented in the Chinese astrology are the fourth, fifth, and sixth rays. Well, the seventh ray either. Although with the seventh ray, you get this idea of, well, of order, because it's connected with the physical plane. So each of these rays is also associated with a plane, and it goes straight up from the physical to the most sublime in the cosmic order. Let's see, what else? Do you have any questions up to this point?
Well, this is also that I've never like put the two together. I'm going to have to watch this again because it's an interesting way you put all that, you know. And I always find the magic squares so interesting, how they kind of have like give you all this information about what they are, you know, like people like Benjamin Franklin. And I mean, so many people were like really into creating magic squares.
That's true. I don't see it so much anymore, but it really was a thing when the West began to open up the more Eastern spirituality. Another point worth mentioning is that when the books of Alice Bailey, Blavatsky, and so forth were written, very little was known in the West about Eastern philosophy, except for the few people who could actually read the languages, you know, academics, in other words. Then when the Chinese took over Tibet and the Tibetans fled, you had this flood of Eastern philosophy that came out, especially the Tibetan Buddhism. This was back in the 50s, and all these correspond to ray cycles as well. So within a century, the 25th and the 75th year are associated with the fifth ray. So there's always a scientific component that especially comes out in the 25th year. And then there's a sort of assimilation that comes into the 75th year. And in the last century, at the 25th year, we had the quantum physics that came in, for instance. At the 75th year, we had the New Age movement that started. So it was more ethereal, but we also had scientific achievements at that time too. And like the internet began to be developed around that time, for instance. There's a 15th year in every century that's very important. And this corresponds to the sixth ray. In the 15th year, if we go back over several centuries, we see that there were major sort of geopolitical, ideological developments. Like we had the Russian Revolution with its ideology, and at the 15th year, around that time of the last century, there's also often conflict associated with it. In this century, at the 15th year, we had the Russian intervention in Syria, for instance, which stopped the Western interventionism in its tracks, basically.
That's an interesting cycle. Yeah, to just go back and track it. I mean, just thinking of the world wars, and it just like kind of goes right along with it.
I mean, in 1812, roughly corresponding with that cycle, we had the War of 1812. And
I remember, you know, Dewey, who did all those cycles. Like I used to go in and read some of those. You're just like hundreds and hundreds. And he had actual cycles where he could predict war. I remember he had several of those. And thinking back now, I'm sure this must have been, you know, equated with.
It would have been part of it, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And where the cycles overlap in a century, for instance, you get important years. So every 15 years, there's something. If these correspond with other cycles, like there's a 35-year cycle, there's a 25-year cycle. It hasn't been fully decided which rays these are associated with. There still seems to be a bit of questioning about it.
Mhm.
But it's interesting to go through and track all those through a century, because the first ray contains all the cycles.
Mhm.
Then you have all the permutations of the same. The 30-year cycle, or the 90-year cycle, is important too. The 90th year of every century, because it's kind of like a summary.
Mhm.
So you go in and you take in what's happened over the last century, and it also sets the tone for the next century. So at the 90th year of last century, Russia fell in a heap. We had all the Westerners go in there and try to balkanize
Right.
the Russian economy. And then along comes Vladimir Putin
Mhm.
at the turn of the century. So that was like wasn't just a century event, that was like a millennial event.
Mhm.
So it's going to be interesting to see how Russia evolves over this coming millennium, not just the next 100 years.
But it's so interesting. Like, I mean, this is all so outside of us. It just, that's all
Yeah.
keeps happening. It's
Yeah.
like we're players in it. It's like
That's right.
simulation.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. So coming back to the Chinese astrology, what you want to do with Chinese astrology is go through each of the quarters of your life. And, I'd be in the third quarter now, being past a certain age.
So you'd be on your day pillar.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd be fully expressing or seeking to fully express the day pillar.
Mhm.
So my day pillar is the rooster, which is about presentation. The 10th cycle corresponds also to the 10th house of the Western horoscope, because it's like the pinnacle, the culmination. It's your reputation.
Mhm.
And the rooster is associated with two things, basically: finance and basically presentation, because the rooster is a metal, not mental, metal element.
Mhm.
And metal is associated with public speaking, with sports, with the animal spirit, strength in general. It's also associated with the lungs. And having that as my day pillar, in the early part of my life, I was prone to lung infections. Because
So
metal.
interesting. I am too. Yeah, I hadn't really thought
Yeah.
about that. Yeah.
It's not so much the case now, because people go through their childhood illnesses.
Right.
The body builds strength, it builds immunity over time.
Mhm.
And as long as we take care of ourselves, which seems to be a problem these days, we don't get sick. Now we have an obesity epidemic in the West, across the West. It's not so bad here in Italy, but
Oh, and diabetes is just through the roof.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's a major problem for COVID, for instance, which is one reason why there's been such a high number of deaths associated with the disease in the U.S. But we won't get into that.
No, we won't. Because I'm so like, While you were going through this, I thought of something with the magic squares. There's this sacred geometry person. His name is Arjun. He's from India. I don't know if you know him. He's written several books, and I've just followed him through ages, right? But anyhow, he took the Bhagavad, and then you know how you flow it, like from the west to the north, I mean, the middle to the northwest to the west, to the northeast, south, south, north, southwest, east, southeast, and you do that flow. I do that all the time in my mind. He found that it's the matrix of the diamond. He's written a whole thing on it. I found that so interesting because they talked about the diamond in the cave in the center of the head for Chinese medicine. Anyhow, it was just a little aside, like how there's so much stuff like that. And then you put planetary on it, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's all interrelated. And the one thing that's most pleasing and interesting about Chinese philosophy is that everything is interlinked.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the basic theory transfers from one discipline to another. So you have the bases of the cycles, which transfers into Chinese medicine, which transfers into the philosophy and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
It's all related to the inner person.
Yeah, it's so cohesive. It's really interesting how you, like for feng shui, you can read books on acupuncture. And speaking of that, you once, like, I don't know, 30 years ago or so, you wrote a book, 1,000 Points of Light. Was that it? And I think you still can find it online. It's so interesting because it just goes into acupuncture at such a different level. I wanted to share that with everybody. Just go look it up.
Yeah. Well, I have one of the few copies left. There are only 500 copies printed.
Wow.
This was done through the University of the Seven Rays. It's online. You can find it at the Moria Federation.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, that book was not so much about acupuncture. It was about the little lesser centers.
No, the minor
centers.
Chakras. Yeah. No, it was it's just amazing.
I'll just give people a quick look. This is the book.
Oh, yeah. I just have one that I printed off like forever.
Yeah, and let me find a diagram here. Yeah. And all these little centers all over the body. And these are only a few of them. There's said to be at least over 100 of them.
Wow.
They're basically where the acupuncture meridians either cross or come very close together. Mm-hmm. So that's how you find them.
Now, speaking of that, like in your bio, we didn't have your website, and we're almost out at time now. So can you tell how people get and how they can sign up for your newsletter so they can get your astrology report?
Yeah, I can send you a link after you can put it on the video.
Oh, now put it under the video.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's melvinartley.com.
Okay, so that's easy.
Yeah.
Now I'll put that in my newsletter. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the process of updating the site. So some people have difficulty contacting me. You can also just email me at melvin@melvinartley.com.
Okay.
And it's probably a better way to do it.
Okay, so we got that, so at least they can contact you and get it. But this was so interesting. I really am going to watch this again because I love the concept of the rays and the Chinese, all of that. So thank you, Melvin. I'm sure people are just like going to, wow, how you got all that together. Plus all of that, like with those points of light in the body, that's a lot of research.
Yeah, it's been a joy. It's been a passion. And hopefully people will pick it up and run with it at some point. You know,
Yeah.
it's all obscure right now, but I'll be putting up books on it in the next few years.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much. Have a good
Great
one.
to see you again.
Yeah, have a good time there over in Italy.
Oh, we do.
Okay.
My wife and my 4 dogs.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Ciao.